The Wild West, a land of lawlessness, where bullets spoke louder than words and legends were written in blood. Outlaws roamed the frontier, robbing banks, looting trains, and gunning down anyone who stood in their way. But among them, 7 names struck fear into the hearts of lawmen and civilians alike. These were not just criminals. They were ruthless, cunning, and unstoppable. From Jesse James, the fearless gang leader, to Billy the Kid, the gunslinger who defied the law, and Belle Starr, the bandit queen who played by her own rules, each of them left behind a trail of violence, betrayal, and mystery. But how did their reigns of terror begin? And how did they meet their fate? Buckle up, because this is the story of the 7 most feared outlaws of the Wild West and their insane crimes. Jesse James, the outlaw who terrorized the Wild West. Jesse James was one of the most infamous outlaws of the American West, leading a life of crime that made him both feared and admired. Born in Missouri in 1847, he grew up during the turbulent years of the Civil War, which shaped his violent future. As a teenager, he joined a Confederate guerrilla group known as Quantrill's Raiders, a ruthless band that carried out brutal attacks on Union forces and civilians. These early experiences in guerrilla warfare hardened Jesse, teaching him the art of ambush, hit-and-run tactics, and merciless killings. After the war, Jesse and his older brother, Frank James, turned to crime as a way of life. Alongside the James Younger gang, they became legendary bank robbers, terrorizing towns across the Midwest. Their first major heist occurred in 1866, when they robbed the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, escaping with thousands of dollars. This robbery marked the beginning of Jesse's bloody reign over the region. The gang continued their spree, targeting banks, trains, and stagecoaches, always leaving a trail of bodies behind. Jesse's reputation as a cold-blooded killer was cemented when he gunned down a cashier during a robbery, making it clear that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Jesse James was more than just a robber. He was a master of deception. He often disguised himself and used his connections to stay ahead of the law. Despite his ruthless crimes, many people saw him as a Robin Hood-like figure, a man who stole from the rich and supposedly helped the poor. In reality, Jesse's actions were driven by greed and revenge, rather than any noble cause. His gang's most famous heist was the Northfield Bank Raid in 1876, a daring attempt to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota. However, the townspeople fought back, leading to a bloody gunfight that resulted in several gang members being killed or captured. Jesse and Frank barely escaped, and from that moment on, the gang was never the same. Despite being hunted by lawmen and Pinkerton detectives, Jesse refused to give up his life of crime. He formed a new gang and continued robbing trains, often killing anyone who got in his way. His paranoia grew as he realized that betrayal could come from within his own circle. By the early 1880s, Jesse was living under an alias in St. Joseph, Missouri, with his wife and children, trying to keep a low profile while planning his next move. However, his past finally caught up with him in 1882. Desperate for the $10,000 reward placed on Jesse's head, Robert Ford, a new recruit in Jesse's gang, plotted against him. On April 3rd, while Jesse was adjusting a picture on the wall of his home, Ford took his chance and shot him in the back of the head. The outlaw who had evaded capture for so long was dead in an instant. Jesse James' death was met with mixed reactions. Some celebrated the end of his reign of terror, while others mourned him as a folk hero. His legend only grew after his assassination, with dime novels, newspapers, and later Hollywood films romanticizing his life. But beneath the myth, Jesse James was a ruthless outlaw whose name became synonymous with violence, crime, and betrayal. Billy the Kid, the young gunslinger who became a legend. Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty in 1859, was one of the most notorious outlaws of the American Wild West. His short life was filled with violence, gunfights, and prison escapes, making him a legend. His criminal reputation was built on the claim that he killed 21 men, one for every year of his life, though historians believe the real number was closer to 9. Regardless of the count, Billy's quick temper, deadly aim, and ability to evade capture made him a feared name across the frontier. Billy's trouble with the law started young. After his mother died when he was just 14, he was left to fend for himself. His first arrest came at age 16, when he was caught stealing food. Soon after, he was arrested again for stealing clothing and firearms, but he managed to escape from jail. This was just the beginning of his outlaw life. As he moved across the Southwest, he fell in with the wrong crowds, engaging in cattle rustling, gambling, and gunfights. By the time he was in his late teens, Billy had already killed several men. His most infamous crimes took place during the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. The war was a bitter feud between two rival factions of cattlemen and businessmen. Billy, siding with the regulators, became one of the most feared gunmen in the conflict. One of his most famous killings occurred in 1878, when he and his gang ambushed and murdered Sheriff William Brady, who had been hunting him. This act cemented Billy's status as a wanted man, and lawmen across the state began to track him down. Despite being constantly pursued, Billy remained elusive. His legend grew as he repeatedly broke out of jail, the most famous escape happening in 1881. After being captured and sentenced to death for his crimes, he was held in the Lincoln County Courthouse under heavy guard. However, in a daring move, Billy overpowered a deputy, stole his gun, and shot both of his guards dead before escaping on horseback. The boldness of his jailbreak only added to his growing legend. Billy's luck, however, was running out. Pat Garrett, a former friend turned lawman, made it his mission to track him down. After weeks of searching, Garrett finally located Billy at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett waited in the darkness inside Pete Maxwell's house. When Billy entered, likely looking for food, Garrett fired a single shot, hitting him in the chest. The young outlaw died instantly at just 21 years old. Billy the Kid's death only fueled his legend. Some refused to believe he was really dead, and over the years many claimed to be him, hoping to cash in on his fame. His story became one of the most famous in Wild West history, inspiring movies, books, and songs. Despite his violent nature, some still see him as a tragic figure, an orphaned boy caught up in lawlessness, forced to fight to survive. Whether seen as a hero or a cold-blooded killer, Billy the Kid remains one of the most enduring figures of the American frontier. Butch Cassidy, the outlaw who outsmarted the law. Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866, was one of the most legendary outlaws of the Wild West. Unlike many of his violent contemporaries, Cassidy was known for his charm, wit, and a preference for robbing without bloodshed whenever possible. As the leader of the infamous Wild Bunch gang, he became one of the most successful bank and train robbers in American history. His daring heists, clever escapes, and eventual disappearance in South America turned him into a folk hero. Cassidy grew up in Utah in a Mormon family, but soon fell into a life of crime. His first known offense was stealing a pair of jeans and some pie from a local store, a minor crime compared to what was to come. By his 20s, he had teamed up with a group of outlaws and began robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains. Unlike many of his fellow criminals, Cassidy had a reputation for being nonviolent, preferring to avoid unnecessary killings. This earned him a degree of public sympathy, as he was seen as a gentleman bandit rather than a ruthless killer. In the 1890s, Cassidy formed the Wild Bunch, a gang that included Harry the Sundance Kid Longabaugh, Kid Curry, and other notorious outlaws. Together they carried out some of the most daring robberies of the era. One of their most famous heists occurred in 1899 when they robbed a Union Pacific train in Wyoming, making off with $60,000, a fortune at the time. The gang became so skilled at evading capture that law enforcement, including the famed Pinkerton detectives, struggled to keep up. They would rob a bank or train, then disappear into the wilderness, using hidden trails and safe houses to stay ahead of their pursuers. But as the United States modernized and law enforcement became more effective, Cassidy realized that the West was no longer a safe haven for outlaws. In 1901, he and Sundance, along with Sundance's lover Etta Place, fled to South America, hoping to start a new life. They initially settled in Argentina, where they tried to live as ranchers, but old habits died hard. Before long, they were robbing banks again, continuing their criminal career in a new land. Their luck ran out in 1908, in Bolivia. The details of their final days remain shrouded in mystery, but the official story states that after robbing a payroll in San Vicente, Cassidy and Sundance were trapped by the Bolivian army in a small village. After a fierce shootout, both men were reportedly killed. However, speculation persists that Cassidy faked his death and returned to the United States under a new identity. Some claim to have seen him alive years later, though no solid evidence ever emerged. Butch Cassidy remains one of the most fascinating figures of the Wild West, a criminal who, unlike many of his contemporaries, tried to avoid bloodshed and relied on cunning rather than violence. His story of high-stakes heists, thrilling escapes, and an ambiguous ending has inspired countless movies and books, solidifying his place as one of history's greatest outlaws. John Wesley Hardin, the deadliest gunslinger of the Wild West. John Wesley Hardin was one of the most feared and ruthless gunfighters of the American frontier. Unlike many outlaws who turned to crime for money, Hardin killed for personal reasons, grudges, and sometimes simply for being insulted. By the time he was 25, he claimed to have killed over 40 men, though the real number is debated. What set him apart from others was not just his high body count, but his deadly skill with a gun and his absolute lack of remorse. Born in Texas in 1853, Hardin was raised in a strict religious household. His father was a Methodist preacher. But despite his upbringing, he had a violent temper and a knack for trouble from a young age. His first known killing happened when he was 15 years old, when he shot a former slave during an argument. Though Hardin claimed the shooting was in self-defense, he fled town to avoid arrest, marking the beginning of his life as a fugitive. Hardin quickly earned a reputation as a cold-blooded killer. Unlike outlaws who robbed banks or trains, his crimes were deeply personal. He killed lawmen, gamblers, and anyone who crossed him. One of the most notorious stories about Hardin was that he killed a man for snoring. While staying at a hotel in Abilene, Kansas, he was reportedly annoyed by the loud snoring of a man in the next room. Instead of ignoring it, he fired several bullets through the wall, killing the man instantly. Despite his violent tendencies, Hardin was highly intelligent and educated. He was a skilled writer and often justified his murders in later years, claiming they were all in self-defense. He also had a unique ability to evade capture, constantly changing locations, names, and even disguising himself. At one point, he led a group of outlaws and became involved in various Texas feuds, adding more bodies to his list. His luck ran out in 1877, when he was finally captured by Texas Rangers while trying to escape on a train. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for killing a sheriff's deputy. During his time behind bars, Hardin surprisingly reformed himself, or at least tried to. He studied law and even became a model prisoner. After serving 17 years, he was released in 1894, claiming he wanted to start a new life as a lawyer. But the Wild West was not so forgiving. Hardin couldn't escape his past, and he quickly got into trouble again. In 1895, he was involved in a dispute in El Paso, Texas, where he had been practicing law. One of his hired gunmen, John Selman Sr., turned against him. On August 19, 1895, while Hardin was playing dice in a saloon, Selman walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The once feared gunslinger, who had survived countless duels and shootouts, was finally taken down by a bullet he never saw coming. John Wesley Hardin remains one of the deadliest and most infamous figures of the Old West. Unlike outlaws like Jesse James or Butch Cassidy, he wasn't just a thief, he was a pure killer, driven by rage, revenge, and pride. His story, filled with gunfights, escapes, and betrayal, continues to fascinate those who study the Wild West. Belle Starr, the bandit queen of the Wild West. Belle Starr was one of the most notorious female outlaws of the Wild West, earning a reputation as the Bandit Queen. Unlike many of her male counterparts who were known for ruthless killings, Belle was feared for her cunning, connections, and ability to control dangerous men. She lived a life filled with crime, betrayal, and mystery, and her violent death remains unsolved to this day. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848 in Missouri, Belle grew up in a wealthy Southern family. However, the Civil War changed everything. Her family supported the Confederacy and became friends with famous outlaws like Jesse James and the younger brothers. This early exposure to criminals shaped Belle's future and led her down a path of lawlessness. Her first husband, Jim Reed, was a horse thief and outlaw, and she eagerly joined him in his criminal activities. After Reed was killed by lawmen, Belle took over his criminal operations and became involved with notorious gangs, helping them plan robberies, hide stolen horses, and evade capture. She used her intelligence and charm to manipulate men, often working behind the scenes while leaving the dirty work to others. However, she wasn't afraid to pick up a gun when necessary, and her reputation for being a deadly shot only added to her legend. Belle married Sam Starr, a Cherokee outlaw, and together they ran a criminal empire in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. The couple specialized in horse theft and bootlegging, using their extensive connections with outlaws like Frank and Jesse James to expand their influence. They threw wild parties, bribed local officials, and created a safe haven for criminals on their land. Lawmen tried repeatedly to bring her down, but Belle always found a way to escape justice, either through legal loopholes or pure intimidation. Despite her reputation, Belle was eventually arrested multiple times. In 1883, she was convicted of horse theft and sentenced to 9 months in prison, a rare punishment for a woman in those days. Even behind bars, she maintained her fierce attitude, reportedly dressing elegantly and charming prison guards. After her release, she continued her outlaw lifestyle, but trouble followed her everywhere. On February 3, 1889, just 2 days before her 41st birthday, Belle Starr was shot dead in an ambush near her home in Oklahoma. She was riding her horse when an unknown attacker shot her in the back, knocking her off the saddle. As she struggled to get up, the killer fired another shot at close range, ensuring her death. The identity of her murderer remains a mystery. Some believe it was a former lover, seeking revenge. Others suspect her own son or a rival outlaw. No one was ever convicted, and her death only added to her legend. Belle Starr's story is unique among Wild West outlaws. Unlike Jesse James or Billy the Kid, she wasn't leading violent shootouts. She was using her intelligence, charm, and criminal connections to control the men around her. Though she met a brutal end, her legacy as the Bandit Queen remains one of the most fascinating tales of the Wild West. The Dalton Gang, the outlaws who tried to rob 2 banks at once. The Dalton Gang was one of the most infamous outlaw groups of the Wild West, known for their bold train and bank robberies. Led by Bob Gratt and Emmett Dalton, the gang started as lawmen before turning to crime. Their daring attempt to rob 2 banks at the same time in 1892 ended in a deadly shootout that became one of the most famous moments in Wild West history. The Daltons were originally from Kansas, and some of the brothers worked as deputy marshals before crossing over to the other side of the law. Inspired by the Jesse James gang, they saw crime as a faster way to make money. Their first major crimes were horse theft and cattle rustling, but soon they moved on to robbing trains and banks, becoming a major problem for law enforcement. The gang quickly gained a reputation for fearlessness and violence. In 1891, they pulled off a train robbery in California, but the authorities caught up with them. While Bob and Emmett managed to escape, Grat was captured and sentenced to prison. However, this setback didn't stop them. Bob formed a new crew, including Bill Doolin and other famous outlaws, and they continued their robbery spree across the Midwest. Their most daring and reckless crime happened on October 5, 1892, in Coffeyville, Kansas. The Daltons came up with an insane plan. They decided to rob 2 banks at the same time, a feat that no other outlaw gang had attempted before. The plan was to hit the Coffeyville First National Bank and the CM Condon Bank simultaneously, escape on horseback, and disappear before anyone could react. But the plan went horribly wrong. The townspeople recognized the Daltons as they walked toward the banks and quickly armed themselves. As soon as the gang tried to escape, a massive shootout erupted in the streets. Citizens, lawmen, and even store owners with rifles opened fire on the gang. Bullets flew from all directions, and within minutes, it turned into a bloodbath. Bob Dalton, the gang's leader, was shot dead instantly. His brother Grat was also gunned down, along with 2 other gang members. Emmett Dalton was shot 23 times, but incredibly, he survived. The townspeople had won. 5 men lay dead in the streets, and only 1 outlaw lived to tell the tale. Emmett was captured and sentenced to life in prison, but his story didn't end there. After serving 14 years, he was paroled and reformed his life. He moved to Hollywood and became a writer and actor, even consulting on movies about his own gang. He lived until 1937, long enough to see his own legend grow in the history books. The Dalton gang's failed Coffeyville raid became one of the most famous shootouts in Wild West history. Their overconfidence and daring double bank robbery attempt ended in disaster, proving that even the most fearless outlaws could fall in a hail of bullets. Their story remains one of the most dramatic and deadly tales of the Old West. Sam Bass, the Texas outlaw who pulled off the biggest train robbery. Sam Bass was one of the most notorious outlaws of the Wild West, known for his bold train and stagecoach robberies. Unlike some criminals who met violent deaths in shootouts, Bass became famous for pulling off the largest train robbery in Union Pacific history, only to be gunned down by Texas Rangers before he could enjoy his fortune. His short, wild life made him one of the most legendary figures of the American frontier. Born in Indiana in 1851, Bass had a rough start in life. He was orphaned as a child and worked a series of odd jobs, eventually making his way to Texas. Originally, he tried to make an honest living as a cowboy and freight hauler, but bad luck and a taste for gambling led him into a life of crime. He soon teamed up with a gang of horse thieves and bandits, beginning a criminal career that would make him infamous. Bass's most daring heist happened in 1877 when he and his gang robbed a Union Pacific train in Big Springs, Nebraska. They hit the jackpot, stealing $60,000 in freshly minted gold coins, an astronomical sum at the time. It was the biggest train robbery in the history of the railroad, instantly making Sam Bass one of the most wanted men in America. However, rather than hiding or using the money wisely, Bass and his gang spent their loot recklessly, gambling and drinking in Texas. This carelessness quickly put them on the radar of law enforcement, especially the Texas Rangers, who were determined to bring them down. Bass refused to quit while he was ahead. In 1878, he planned another bank robbery in Round Rock, Texas, but lawmen had already been tipped off about his whereabouts. On July 19, 1878, as Bass and his gang scouted the town, they were ambushed by Texas Rangers. A violent gunfight erupted in the streets, and Bass was shot multiple times. Though he managed to escape the initial firefight, he collapsed outside of town, bleeding to death. The Rangers found him the next day, barely alive. On July 21, 1878, Sam Bass died from his wounds, just one day after his 27th birthday. His last words reportedly were, "The world is bobbing around." Despite his short career, Bass became a legend in Texas, with folk songs and stories portraying him as a Robin Hood-like figure who stole from the rich railroads and gave to the poor. In reality, he was more of a reckless gambler who never got the chance to enjoy his fortune. His sensational train robbery, wild gunfights, and dramatic downfall secured his place in Wild West history, making him one of the most memorable outlaws of his time.